The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
In a nation proud of its diasporas and links around the world, how well would a foreign registry manage the nuances between engagement, influence, and interference? Tonight, we'll explore that. First up, political scientist Joseph Wong is here on why some modern Asian nations transitioned to democracy while others did not. It's Monday, March 27th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Why have countries such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan transitioned to democracy as their economies grew, whereas China, Vietnam, and Cambodia did not? That's the question at the heart of Joseph Wong's new book. It's called From Development to Democracy: The Transformations of Modern Asia. Co-authored with Dan Slater, Professor Wong teaches political science and is the Roz and Ralph Halbert Professor of Innovation at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and he joins us now. Joe, good to have you back in that chair.
Terrific. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
I want to start with this. This book was 10 years in the making. How come?
Well, it began around about 10 years ago. Dan and I met for the first time, and he was presenting a paper on strong state democratization and the prospects of democracy in places like Singapore and Malaysia.
Strong states.
Strong states. And I was writing a paper on Taiwan and South Korea, and the two of us met at a conference. We had known of each other for years, and we decided to start working together on this. And we wrote a paper, actually, the first paper version of this, which we published in 2013, we wrote in a cafe in Madison, Wisconsin over one weekend. And we actually wrote 18,000 words.
Why Madison, Wisconsin?
Well, that's where we both went to school. I did my
okay.
PhD there. He did his undergrad there, and we thought that would be a great place to do this. And it was like, sort of like we had our laptop set up in a cafe, like Battleship, that game. And we ended up writing 18,000 words in one weekend, and we thought there might be something here. And so about a year after that, after the article came out, Princeton University Press came on board and asked if we wanted to write a book version of the article, and that's when we set out to do it. And it took 10 years because, frankly, the region was just changing so much. When we had first planned to have the book go to the press about 5 years ago, China looked very different than it does today. Myanmar was still under the rule of a democratically elected Aung San Suu Kyi. And I think in many ways our conclusions would have been very different had the book come out 5 years before. So it took a while for us to just keep pace with the kind of transformations that are occurring in the region. And
maybe ultimately a good thing that it did take as long as it did, because you might have written a different book 5 years ago.
I think so, and I think the timing, frankly, couldn't be better. I mean, the debate right now and the showdown between authoritarianism and democracy is a debate that is raging, and the consequences couldn't be, more serious than they are now. So it's a good time for the book to come out.
Well, let's compare and contrast then, because you do tell us in the book that as countries move towards democracy, some of them start in positions of strength, some of them start in positions of weakness. Ultimately, they can get to the same place. What's the difference between whether you start as a strong country or a weak country?
Well, the basic argument of the book is that, at least in the Asia region, and we have found similar patterns in other parts of the world and at different times as well, that when you have a strong state undergirded by strong state institutions, a record of economic development, and importantly, a strong political party, that transitions that are initiated by those kinds of regimes and under those conditions actually lead to more stable democratic transitions, more resilient democracies over the longer term.
What's the best example in your view of that?
The best example, and what really sort of features centrally in the book, is the case of Taiwan. If we go back and you look at the history of Taiwan's political development, this was a regime in the 1970s and early 1980s that by any measure was one of the most autocratic and efficiently autocratic regimes around. And then in the mid-1980s, the opposition movement begins to foment and gain some strength. And in 1986, you have opposition leaders forming a political party called the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, and it was formed illegally, actually, because Taiwan was still under martial law. And at that moment, most observers around the world who, watched Taiwan politics assumed that the incumbent regime, the KMT or the Kuomintang, would do what all autocratic regimes do when an opposition starts to form, which is to
crush them.
Right, to crush them. And this is what they had done for decades. And had done, from the point of view of an autocrat, done very, very effectively. But what we actually see is the regime standing down. And a year later, martial law being lifted, and the introduction of elections in the early 1990s, and the first full and free and fair presidential elections in 1996. And so we begin to see a transition to democracy. What was puzzling, and what is at the core of this book then, is why would a regime concede democracy, as the KMT did in the 1980s and late 1980s into the 1990s? Why would a regime concede democracy when it was so strong?
Right? And what's the answer?
The argument that we make in the book is that when regimes can see on the horizon darker clouds looming, that is to say, they're receiving signals that they've passed their apex of power, but they're still very powerful, they're credible, they have a credible track record of economic development. Under those conditions, those regimes that are confident that if they were to have elections, they would win, confident that if they were to usher in democracy, the political economy would remain stable. Under those conditions, strong parties, strong state regimes can concede democracy and concede a very stable democratic transition.
The flip side of your argument, though, is, let's go back 40 years, Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines.
Yeah.
I mean, he thought that's where he was.
Right.
He called an election, didn't work out.
That's right.
That's potentially one argument for why a lot of places will not risk the way you've just described.
Yeah, and so that's right. And the Marcos story, I think, is really important. In fact, we begin the book in a very kind of simple narrative form about what we see as a democracy through weakness scenario versus, say, what we argue as a democracy through strength scenario. And the Marcos example is a perfect example of a regime that had become so weakened, right, that had passed its best before date, if you will, and such that by the time that Marcos initiates any form of political liberalization, it becomes very clear that actually the regime is so thoroughly delegitimated that he really has only one option, which is to flee the country. And this is what we mean by democracy through weakness, a democracy that ultimately emerges from the ashes of a collapsed autocratic regime, but one that is ultimately, and certainly history has, I think, demonstrated, that those kinds of transitions actually result in very unstable democratic transitions.
Yet, who's the head of Philippines today?
That's right. That's right. Well, that's right. I mean, this is electoral politics electoral politics are electoral politics. And you will see in many cases as well a kind of authoritarian nostalgia. And so it's not entirely surprising. And again, I think that in many ways that just demonstrates the kind of the quality of democracy that you want to see ensue. And if you compare that, for instance, with what we see in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, those are really enviable democracies, right? On objective measures, on democracy indices and so forth. These are places that are stable political orders in which we've also seen continued, economic prosperity.
What do you think the special sauce is in those cases that you just mentioned, which is apparently absent from other places which have yet to figure it out?
Well, in the book, we have 12 cases that we look at, and we divide them into 4 clusters of cases. And the examples of Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan are what we call the developmental statist cluster. And these are a distinctive group of political economies in the sense that they are high-growth economies in the post-war period. They're undergirded by what many refer to as a developmental state. So you have a bureaucracy that is very strong, very capable, very intent on growing their economies. These are political economies that have done a good job in reducing poverty, in promoting more rather than less inclusive economic development. And at the helm are strong political parties, right? And a strong ruling regime during the autocratic period. And so this really sets the stage then for a regime, again, that sees these signals of darker clouds on the horizon, electoral signals, maybe the rise in contentious politics and so forth. They see that they are no longer, their hold on power is no longer unassailable, and they say preemptively and strategically, this would be the right time to concede democracy. But this is a unique group of cases because, for all of the reasons I've just stated, high growth, strong states, strong parties.
Well, you've led me nicely to where I want to go next, which is China. And that is, you've basically put out a list there of all the things that China has: strong bureaucracy, strong institutions. They've done an incredible job reducing poverty for hundreds of millions of people, a strong regime, and yet the final thing on that checklist, and therefore a preparedness or a willingness to take a risk on democracy, that one clearly isn't there for China yet. Why not?
Yeah, this is a question I think that perplexes a lot of people. And indeed, when we were writing the book, China is such an important case. And we wanted to be sure that this was not a book solely about China. And the press was very clear as well. Princeton University Press, which published it, was very clear that they were not necessarily interested in a book solely about China. So China was going to be one of 12 cases. But it's such an important case. It's such an outsized case in every respect. And we'd originally thought we'd write one chapter on China, but as you can imagine, it's such a big case. The history is just so long, the sort of the ups and downs and so forth are so complicated, we couldn't do that. And so we decided to write one chapter, which took us to 1989, which is important, right? Because this was a moment in June of 1989 when many people thought this was an opportunity for the regime to democratize, right?
Tiananmen Square.
Tiananmen Square. And that this was, in many ways, for those who are proponents of democracy, that this was a lost opportunity. And the argument we make in the book is that it was indeed a lost opportunity, but it wasn't the most ideal set of circumstances for a democracy through strength scenario to unfold. Because when we look back, actually, at the regime in 1989, it was not a particularly strong regime. It was rife with elite conflict and elite split. China really experiences its economic takeoff after the early 1990s, so China was still relatively poor at that time. And it was only about half a generation removed from the political chaos of the Cultural Revolution, right? So this was not a regime that was in any position to concede democracy through strength.
Not then, but today it is.
But today, and so that's where we end off on the book, right? Is the argument or the suggestion that if China were to democratize today, if the Chinese Communist Party were to initiate, for instance, a democratic transition, that it would fulfill all the criteria of a democracy through strength scenario. That it's inconceivable that if the CCP, at least in our view, if the CCP were to initiate free and fair elections, that there would be any viable challengers that could unseat the CCP from power. So, there's a way in which one can make the argument, actually, that democracy and democratization is incentive compatible with these regimes. It makes sense. It's in their self-interest to democratize from a position of strength. And so China is what we call a prime candidate for precisely this kind of political transformation to occur.
Which people have been saying for 3 or 4 decades.
People have been saying for 3 or 4 decades, but I think that we're in many ways, I think we're looking in the wrong places. I think, sadly, and ultimately erroneously, I think we're all looking for democracy to emerge from a collapsed CCP. Right? When you think about and you read and you contemplate what many China watchers are saying around the world, it's this presumption that democracy can only emerge in China if and when the CCP regime collapses, or if and when the economy collapses. In other words,
neither are about to happen.
Neither are about to happen. Frankly, in terms of a collapsed China, this would be an awful, from a purely humanitarian point of view, right? We're talking about close to 1.5 billion people. This would be really calamitous for a lot of people. Its economy collapsing would not only be economically calamitous for 1.5 billion, it would have reverberations around the world. Like the rest of the world would feel this as well. So I think in many ways, by looking for democracy to emerge in China from the only way in which democracy can emerge is from a collapsed regime, is actually looking in the wrong places. And so as we contemplate this, I'm not so sure for 3 or 4 decades we've been looking for democracy through strength in China. I think we've been looking for democracy through collapse in China. The opportunity that is before us is to make the argument, as we do in the book, that actually democratizing from a position of strength to leverage, the CCP's extraordinary track record and so forth, may actually result in a fairer, liberal democracy, and one in which we might even see the CCP remain in power, but as a democratically elected government.
Here's a quote from your book that speaks to that. Sheldon, if we can. Strong parties are national parties. This party machinery can be converted and deployed in democratic electoral competition after authoritarian controls are lifted. Although democratic concessions always entail risks, the robustness of a built ruling party infrastructure mitigates those risks. Individual party members might defect to other parties or run as independents under democracy, but the party is virtually certain to live on as an authoritarian successor party when democracy is conceded by an authoritarian regime that is still strong. In effect, echoing what you've just said. As China looks at the neighborhood that it's in, what example does it take from what it's seen?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When we've talked about this thesis in China, and some people may be surprised that we've been able to give talks on this topic in China, even though it is an argument ultimately about democratizing China. It's an argument that is a little different, right? It's not about wishing the collapse of the regime. It's instead trying to convince the regime that by creating a more fair, liberal, democratic system, it's actually incentive compatible. It actually serves the interests of the ruling party. And we point to examples like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, as we also argue in the book, a place like Indonesia, which is a large, large country, not unlike China, with separatist impulses on the periphery and so forth. When we point to those examples where you can introduce democracy and yet the regime stays, or the incumbent party stays relevant, if not actually staying in power. Unfortunately, I think in China, oftentimes, they'll look westward and they'll point to the former Soviet Union. And they'll say, no, actually, the lessons we learn from our neighborhood is that when you democratize, you actually unleash political chaos and you create political economic instability, and you derail all of the developmental ambitions that the regime might have. I think that's the wrong lesson to take. And we have suggested to our colleagues, our friends, our interlocutors in China, that actually the Soviet example, or the collapse of the former Soviet Union, is a great example, actually, of a regime that simply waited too long. Right. That by the time glasnost and perestroika were unleashed, it wasn't perestroika and glasnost that caused the regime to collapse. Rather, they just simply revealed the internal rot that had already besought the regime and accelerated in many ways the collapse of the regime. So the lesson actually to be learned from that neighbor is don't wait too long. Right? Democratize when you are in a position of strength, when you have what we call victory confidence and stability confidence. The confidence that if you were to democratize, it would not necessarily spell the end of the regime, or it would not spell the end of the ruling party. And it may, in fact, actually create even more stability so that the kind of political, economic ambitions of the Chinese government can actually be fulfilled over the longer term.
When you have these conversations with your academic colleagues in China, do they understand where they are on the continuum of history right now? And do they take your point that, yes, we should probably tell the political leaders in the country not to wait too long, otherwise you look more like the Soviet Union rather than Taiwan, Japan, South Korea?
Well, it's an interesting observation because, as I say, we've been quite welcome to make this argument in China, and so it's not seen as an offensive argument or by any stretch. And many will concede that the logic of our argument makes a great deal of sense. And they will say in private, this is a very compelling argument, and I think this is something the regime ought to contemplate.
Are they?
Well, the challenge is that ultimately it's still a risk, right? And as we point out, and as you noted in the quote that you just read, that preemptively conceding democracy always entails risks, right? James Scott, a very prolific political scientist and anthropologist, once referred to this as, democracy ushering, quote unquote, the inconvenience of losing. There's the chance that you might lose, right? And that's the whole point of democracy.
Inconvenience of losing.
The inconvenience of losing. And that's the whole point of democracy. And so when push comes to shove, people, it's a theory about how political elites and political parties might behave. But in reality, these are people who are weighing the risks and benefits of making such a decision. And so it's not quite as easy as one might argue in a more sort of theoretical piece as we do in this book. So I think that people have been receptive to the argument. But, as we also lay out in the very end of the book, it seems very unlikely that under the current Xi Jinping government, that any such notion would really be seriously entertained.
Sure, but the status quo is a risk as well. There's no such thing as a risk-free scenario out there. And if they hang on too long and it becomes sclerotic like the Soviet Union, they could end up in the same place.
This is exactly the point that we often try to make. Yeah. And one of the reasons why we suggest that the CCP actually is a prime candidate, the Chinese Communist Party is a prime candidate for democracy through strength, is because when you do look on the horizon, I think you would either have to have your head in the sand, or I think you'd have to be terribly naive to not see those dark clouds, right? There are economic headwinds in the future. There is a geopolitical rivalry that at times may seem very energizing for the body politic, but at times is very taxing, right? So there are darker clouds on the horizon. There are the kinds of signals that autocratic regimes should be able to see, and if they so choose, can see the value of conceding democracy from a position, in the case of the CCP, quite extraordinary strength.
Now, your book focuses on Asia. And you've laid in place some theories and arguments for why it is the way it is in Asia. Do you know if that works for every other region of the world as well? In other words, could you take that template and put it on Latin America or Africa and say, principles are just the same there?
Well, I think the logic is the same, and we have published an article with colleagues who study Africa and Europe. So we published a piece with Rachel Rydell and Daniel Ziblatt looking at this argument of democracy through strength or authoritarian-led democratization in West Africa, East and Southeast Asia, and in England in an earlier period. And so the theory travels across time and space. The conditions may not always be as fortuitous. And again, that's why we have what we call the developmental status cluster as being really the paradigmatic or the paragon of the logic that we're talking about here. But the idea that a regime might concede democracy from a position of strength, I don't think could not travel theoretically across different time and places.
I want to, in our remaining moments here, tap into your most fantastic geopolitical fantasies here, okay? Let's imagine a world where China takes these steps towards democracy, and so does Vietnam, and Myanmar, and Cambodia. Let's imagine Asia as a much more democratic place in the future than it is today. What kind of a world are we living in then?
Well, look, I think, first of all, a country the size of China and as complex and complicated as China, we should expect that democratic transition, which ultimately, I think, would lead to a more liberal political order, is nonetheless going to face challenges. And so it's not automatic. It's certainly not a process that occurs overnight. And as we have seen, for every 2 steps forward we see in the march towards democracy, there's oftentimes a step back. And people have noted this in terms of democratic backsliding and so forth.
But we'd be helpful.
Well, I think
we'd want to encourage that.
I think there'd be an opportunity for us to also be patient, right? And to be supportive when asked of this kind of transformation, to temper our expectations, right, that a transition such as this and as monumental as this would take some time, and that there might be some hiccups along the way. But ultimately what we would see, I think, is a real convergence of the kind of political economic values that are not Western, right, but that are, in fact, quite universal. And that's one of the key points of the book, and we end the book in which we talk about democracy being a universal value, right? That this is something that is not solely the purview of the East or the West, but rather we have certainly not seen any evidence that anybody in the world prefers to live under the threat of repressive autocracy over more freedom and so forth. But that nonetheless, you know, that this convergence of values has to be supported by an international community that supports peace, prosperity, and continued development. And so the very last part of the book says that while democracy is a universal value, it's not the ultimate one. The ultimate value is one in which we have people who enjoy the benefits of peace, prosperity, inclusive economic growth, and so forth. And the promise of democracy, frankly, relies on the continued deliverance of that. So while we may see a more peaceful, a less tense geopolitical community, it does not absolve us of really working on the challenges that allows democracies to endure. And that's about a peaceful coexistence. It's about continued economic prosperity and shared and inclusive growth. That's the big challenge before us.
I look forward to reading the sequel in 25 years when all of that happens.
Terrific, thank you.
From Development to Democracy, The Transformations of Modern Asia, along with Dan Slater, Joseph Wong, the author. Thanks so much, Joe.
Thank you.
Canada has been a nation of immigrants since its founding. As such, people here have connections, often deep and ongoing ones, with the lands of their birth or their ancestors. That's simple enough. But as explosive allegations about foreign interference recently made clear, the nature of those ties can suddenly come into question, sometimes in unexpected ways. With us now to reflect on some of that complexity, let's welcome, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Joanna Chu, national correspondent at the Toronto Star and the author of China Unbound. In Vaughan, Ontario, Kamari Maxine Clark, interim director at the University of Toronto's Centre for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. And here in our studio, Anna Sternsis, director of the Anne Tannenbaum Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. Anna, it's good to see you again. And to our friends Joanna and Kamari and Points Beyond, we're glad you could join us for this discussion as well. Joanna, to you first. The feds have just begun this public consultation on setting up a foreign influence registry. Do we assume this is happening as a direct response to the election interference from China?
Yeah, it appears to be a pretty direct response to the huge, national public backlash against some of the media reports that are based on CSIS spy documents that are primarily focused on efforts of the Chinese state and trying to influence Canadian society, and particularly elections, the last couple of elections. Although CSIS also always stresses that China is not their primary focus, not their main focus, that other countries, including Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, India, are also involved in foreign influence, which, many of us are already aware of. But it bears repeating that it's not just a China issue, but the latest controversies and the latest leaks from CSIS that Global and Globe and Mail reported are focused on China.
No, very fair point. And I don't expect you, obviously, to be able to speak for the entire Chinese diaspora, but I know you are plugged into that. So perhaps you could share what kinds of reactions you're hearing from the Chinese diaspora to this development.
Yeah, it's a very mixed reaction, as you can imagine. But even people who are very in favor and actually have been warning about Beijing's activities in Canada for decades, which I wrote about a couple of weeks ago with Ms. Starr. This has been happening for decades, and I saw records of Chinese Canadians testifying to Parliament as early as 2006, and then subsequently doing so many times a year, trying to get the government to do something about it. But even among that group, there are mixed emotions right now, because while people are happy that we are having this conversation finally, a lot of people are upset and frustrated that it's kind of went and turned into a pretty partisan and some would say ugly direction of rhetoric where there's a lot of finger pointing. Just going on Twitter, I see that people are posting photos or coming up with anecdotes saying this person, I think, met with the Chinese consulate back then. But we have to remember that meeting or being in the same room as a Chinese consulate or a Chinese official doesn't mean you're an agent of the Chinese state. It just means you're in the same room, you're in the same event. So we're missing some cultural context and so also some context of how China operates here in Canada, which is really trying to ingratiate itself with the communities, including Chinese Canadian communities, for decades, trying to pose itself and position itself as a benevolent kind of motherland that will support you even when you're an immigrant and become a citizen here in Canada. So I'm actually doing a piece where I actually looked through the legal definitions of things like foreign influence and agent and things like that. And I realized that part of the problem is that Canada lacks many coherent legal definitions of the words we're using right now, including foreign influence. The RCMP and CSIS operate with two different definitions. The RCMP says it has to be something illegal, which is tricky because in Canada we don't actually have foreign interference laws, and CSIS has its own set of requirements.
Interesting. Kamari, let me get you in and get your sense of at what point do you think diaspora politics become vehicles for foreign interference, and you can define that however you like.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. Well, of course, diaspora politics are vehicles for many things. Diasporic flows are complex. Borders are porous. And the relationship between influence and interference are also complex. So yes, indeed, people, information, with new forms of mediated technologies, there are many platforms through which people communicate. And diasporas, the migration of people from place to place, the circulation of information, of ideas, of convictions, of political agendas, all are part of the diasporic circulation and diasporic conception. So yes, indeed, they are key domains for these forms of circulation.
Anna, your research involves Jewish studies as well as the intersection with the Russian diaspora.
Right.
How has, let's hit this right on the head, how has the Russian invasion of Ukraine affected those diaspora narratives in your experience?
Well, for once, it increased the number of people in those diasporas because Ukrainians are fleeing Ukraine, over 6 million right now, but also Russians are fleeing Russia, and for different reasons. Ukrainians are fleeing violence, Russians are fleeing possible sanctions, possible draft in the army, and general in protesting the war. So what happened with the Jews within those refugees. So we see about 20,000 Jews fleeing Ukraine, and some of them go to Israel. The majority of them go to other places like Germany and Austria. Some are trying to get to Canada. And for Russian Jews, the world is a little bit more closed, so some of them go to Kazakhstan and Armenia and Georgia, and some to Israel. And the way that the dynamic, the politics, the attitudes to Russian invasion of Ukraine transpires to diasporic community really matters on where people came from. A lot of Russian-speaking Jews in Canada, for example, come from Ukraine. And they are dealing with their family members, with their communities being destroyed right now. A lot of Russian people and Russian Jews do feel extremely devastated by what happened and involved in rescue effort or resettlement effort to these for these refugees. So what we're seeing right now is actually one of those transformative points of Russian-speaking Jewish diaspora. And it will be known as before and after, like we had before World War II, after World War II. Now the way that this Russian-speaking Jewish community will evolve also will get Ukrainian-speaking Jewish community. It will be known as before and after.
And a quick follow-up, you said 20,000 Jews from Ukraine had left. Any idea how many Russian Jews have left Russia?
So it's hard to count. Some numbers I heard were about 14 to 17,000 of them settled in Israel, and we know that because they count in Israel, but we have no idea how many went to Georgia, Armenia, or even places like in Western Europe or North America, because if people had visas, they could go everywhere else, and the religion or ethnicity were not registered. So we don't know.
Gotcha. Kamari, I don't have to tell anybody who watches the news in this country that immigration is the main driver of Canada's population and labor force going back a long time. If I look back at the years 2016 to 2021 alone, we got 1.3 million immigrants moving to Canada and settling here. We are a nation of immigrants, overwhelmingly. In what ways do diasporas engage and connect with their homelands?
Yeah, it's an important question to document in many ways, because these diasporic circulations have an influence on everyday politics, both on the federal, provincial, local level, and also fundamentally influence hometown politics in the places of origin. So, for example, if you think about the 2015 Nigerian elections, or even the current elections, the tremendous role of diasporic actors, Nigerians and Nigerian scholars and the elite and policymakers lobbying and ensuring that international organizations, that local organizations ensure that there actually are fair and free elections, that particular issues are on the agenda, that the monetary possibilities are viable because people are giving through remittances. So found ways that the Nigerian diaspora, for example, has influenced the electoral politics there. We see the same in the Caribbean Rim. The significant role, 10% of the GDP is remittance funding, oftentimes that also goes to support political parties. And one of the most classic examples, of course, is around South Africa and anti-apartheid from the late 80s into the early 90s, where diasporic South Africans, as well as people of the African diaspora and well beyond, participated in the implementation of sanctions and other forms of social mobilization to ensure that the particular regime, a racist regime in South Africa, toppled and new forms of democratic politics were put in place. And there's so many examples in the African diaspora: the establishment of foreign ministries, the enabling of dual citizenship, the enabling of the possibility for voting rights for those who live abroad, and the honing of these expat relationships certainly are key. So there are ways that these diasporic politics are being woven into the political and legal infrastructure to enable these formations to happen. There are ways that political convictions, like in the case of South Africa, which is a historic case, but certainly an important case in the African diaspora. There are ways that political convictions and political positions have been mobilized to really transform and produce democratic systems in the case of South Africa. And certainly we see that in many, many African countries, from Ethiopia to Senegal to Cote d'Ivoire, etc. The place of provisions for these possibilities are tremendous.
And Joanna, let's bring it really to today's headlines here. How does the issue of homeland connection become problematic or contentious when somebody is running for office?
I think some of the conversations we're having now are kind of affected by the fact that Ottawa, as the political bubble, is quite elite, and perhaps the makeup of the city of Ottawa, demographics-wise, does not reflect some of the diversity that are in other parts of Canada, such as Vancouver and Toronto. So I think for a long time, it's fair to say that a lot of immigrant groups, people of color feel like they're interest groups that politicians, mostly based in Ottawa or wherever their offices are, try to engage only right before elections. And then they're doing things in a kind of awkward fashion and asking questions like, what do Chinese Canadian voters want? What do they care about? And not grasping the diversity and the complexity and the unique threats and dangers of being a diaspora Canadian. So I can speak in the context of China. Beijing, how it views international Chinese is that they reject the foreignness of people who have sometimes lived in Canada and other places for centuries, for generations, who have never set foot in China. I myself, living in China as a journalist for French media, I was repeatedly denied that identity. I was always treated as, well, you're originally from Hong Kong, not even Hong Kong, you're just Chinese. And you'd be treated as such. And there's been Chinese Canadians, Chinese Australians who are in jail right now in China because they're denied their foreignness. Canadian consulates have trouble reaching them because, according to Chinese law, basically you're only Chinese if you have any kind of connection to China. Even if you weren't born in China, you're kind of the legal system in China, you would imagine, and it isn't very logical. So people in Canada are dealing with this context where their Canadianness is not necessarily protection for them, even living in Canada. So in terms of foreign influence, the consulates here have, again, long had these both kind of carrot and stick approaches of trying to engage with the population of Chinese Canadians. Both carrots in that we will support your businesses, we'll support your families here, we'll make, you're invited to these cultural events, these New Year's celebrations. And then the sticks, these are directed at people in Canada. Many of them are critical of the Chinese government because they chose to leave China, or their parents or grandparents did, because of political persecution. So naturally, many of them are outspoken and are, multilingual, perfectly fluent in English or French, and are trying to raise awareness about issues in China. And that's what Beijing doesn't want. So it uses a stick approach to try to silence people. So a lot of foreign influence in Canada is actually in a way passive because foreign states have successfully silenced diasporas. We don't see it in action because we don't hear from people anymore. A common way to silence them is to threaten their family and friends or their businesses back home in China, or not, I should say home, that's kind of repeating a kind of Beijing trope. But back in China, if you still have any family or friendship connections, or your business has any ties with China, that's leverage for Beijing to use. And that's leverage that has been used and reportedly used against people who aren't of Chinese descent. In Australia, journalist John Garneau, who was very influential in helping Australia craft its foreign interference laws, his friend, Chinese writer friend of his, was used as leverage to try to silence his activities as an Australian. So it's a playbook that is expanding and could affect any Canadian with any ties to China.
Anna, let me ask you about those tens of thousands of Ukrainian Jews or Russian Jews who are now going to new countries, and what kind of democratic engagement they can look forward to, either in their new countries with their new situations, or from their former countries who may want to keep an eye on what's going on.
The circumstances are different for Russian Jews and for Ukrainian Jews. And one thing I do want to say is that this is, I think, one of the first times in modern Jewish history when being Jewish was actually not a factor of whether or not people left the old country. You know what I mean? The Jews are not being targeted or persecuted as Jews either in Russia or in Ukraine, but they are experiencing different challenges as they leave. So, for example, for Russian citizens, one of the major motivation of people who are leaving is for men to avoid the draft in the army because they don't want to serve. So families with boys between the age of 17 and up, they're much more likely to leave than, for example, those families who have daughters or don't have people eligible for that draft. So what are they going to do? They're going to try to go to a country that will let them in, and there's a sense of urgency. And if they're Jews, they actually have Israel available to them. And there's a whole big discussion of whether or not it's an attractive destination. For example, majority Ukrainian Jews chose not to go to Israel because they perceive it as especially difficult. They worry about adaptation, and they prefer to go to countries that have better social packages. And
what does that mean, better social packages?
Oh, better unemployment packages, better support for refugees, also easier time to find work. For example, Canada introduced that Kuwait legislation that allows Ukrainian refugees to start working right away and have full rights here for 3 years. Well, that's very attractive compared to some other places where they don't have those rights. Germany introduced this kind of legislation. So there's a lot of choices for them. And interestingly, the presence of a strong diaspora does not seem to be a factor. It does not seem to be a factor. However, having said that, where it is a factor is on personal connections. So in other words, what we know from refugee studies, that more cultural capital people have, further they can go. And by cultural capital, I mean if they have family somewhere else, if they speak a foreign language, if they have a transferable skill profession that they can apply somewhere else, or if they have a family member living somewhere else, they're much more likely to go there. So people with less cultural capital can go as far as, neighboring village or neighboring town, 10, 15 kilometers away. And people with more opportunities and also actual capital like bank accounts and funds go further. So what we see happening is that Russians who live in Russia are usually people who work remotely, who have access to foreign income, who speak foreign languages. They're the most privileged of all this group of refugees. So they choose to go, they try to go somewhere where the opportunities will continue. And Ukrainian refugees they have to leave fast because they're actually fleeing violence, but where they settle matters which country is more welcoming to them. And I think what will also happen, and we're seeing it already, we'll have to start having a discussion about, who are these new refugees? What is this new diaspora? Comparing to Jews, for example, who left persecution or anti-Semitic policies in the 70s compared to Russian Jews who leave Moscow, for example, today and complain in Israel that there's not enough pumpkin spice latte. There's been a big discussion on the internet. They created a Facebook group called Pumpkin Spice Latte, which has 100,000 members, discussing how you can't get luxuries, like that in Israel. So, so this is a very different discussion compared to the old country discussion of how do I find a job? How do I learn language quickly? How do I fit in? So the complexity of diaspora will stay, and it will definitely inform the politics as well, how they retain connection with Ukraine and with Russia, and how do they deal with all these Russian-speaking people here coming from Ukraine? That's a whole another debate. I think the role of, and also diasporas are no longer one way. So when the war is over, hopefully sooner than later, a lot of people will return, and a lot of people will return to Russia as well. So it will be very interesting to see what will happen once all these people who had experience living abroad are coming back, and what kind of a relationship they will retain with the diaspora.
Absolutely. Kamari, let me ask you about this Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies at U of T that you are the leader of at the moment. Why do you think it's important to understand the circulation of culture and politics as it relates to our geopolitical struggles today?
Sure. Well, states are entities of people, and in part, what we need to do is understand how entities of people negotiate, navigate. What are the complexities? What are the indirect and direct ways that decisions are made? What are the cultural forms that take shape? How do we avoid simply putting everyone in a box and generalizing? And what are the ways that we can teach students, that we can teach policymakers, politicians to think complexly about the social problems in our world? And so part of what we do at the University of Toronto, at the Centre, is to teach courses that really allow us to understand some of the most difficult issues of our time, and to understand them in relation to particular toolkits, in relation to theories of the global, of the transnational, to think about the ways that history informs contemporary relations and contemporary debates, and to apply in many ways a new architecture, a new conceptual architecture to thinking about contemporary complexities in relation to China, in relation to Russia, in different parts of the African diaspora, in the Caribbean and elsewhere. What are the contexts around which we need to think about refugees? What people are mobile and who isn't as mobile? What are the ways that Canadian foreign policy, in fact, discriminates against particular kinds of people coming from particular regions in the world with particular passports? We teach and really try to emphasize the importance of understanding inequality, including inequality in policymaking. And so there are many diverse issues that are of a geopolitical nature that have to do with deep historical issues, deep political issues, the histories of colonialism, the histories of contemporary state formation, the nature of civil wars, and how those wars have an impact on the refugee problems that we have. And so in many ways, it really is about the assemblage of these various components and complexities of our world, and teaching students, teaching colleagues to really put in place conceptualizations that allow us to make sense of those complexities.
Joanna, let me set up my next question for you by reading a snippet of an op-ed that was in the Globe and Mail recently. Ai-Men Lau published this, and it's called "To Really Tackle Beijing's Interference, Canada Must Engage with the Chinese Diaspora." And here's the excerpt. Canada's response continues to miss opportunities to engage with the Chinese diaspora and dissident communities who have long been sounding the alarm on the Chinese Communist Party's meddling in our democracy. The status quo represents a silencing on two fronts. While the Chinese diaspora faces increasing anti-Asian sentiment and marginalization in Canada, the baggage of another home has followed them across oceans. Okay, can I just get you to react to that?
Yeah, I really agree with Ivan. It's not a controversial take. It's pretty much a factual description of what has been going on for a long time. We see that in panels on TV talking about the CSIS leaks about China for over a month. A Chinese person did not appear on some of the major networks. And it's as if it's okay and mainstream to not even notice that Chinese Canadian experts and voices aren't speaking at all and being part of the conversation. When these are exactly the voices I think we need to hear from, because people in the communities tend to have that nuance and context that people say are sometimes missing in conversations. So it's definitely, like the panelists have said today, a structural issue in Canada of marginalization of diaspora voices. And it shows that it's not just a issue of being politically correct or polite. It's actually a pretty crucial matter of policymaking, that we have people who know what they're talking about, helping to contribute to policymaking and public awareness and understanding of these issues. As a journalist, most of my sources on these issues on China are clearly people of Chinese descent or people who have worked and lived in China. That kind of experience in China, as complex a place as it is very crucial. And Canada lacks a lot of the structural pathways for students and people in government to gain this knowledge independently. So Chinese Canadians are a huge resource that are being untapped right now and feeling ignored, and some people feeling like the risk of speaking out isn't worth it, because like Ivan wrote, They risk kind of the stereotyping and anti-Asian racism. Personally, if I try to add some nuance to the conversation, I've been called a CCP, pro-China shill, China hugger, spy, agent, like all of these words thrown out at me. And on the other side, if you are critical and you're actually working with the Canadian government, trying to help come up with solutions or just, passing on information from your communities, there's also the real threat of surveillance and intimidation, and real concrete actions from the Chinese state to try to silence you. Well, the people that we do hear from publicly, you have to appreciate that they're actually taking a great risk in doing so.
Right. We're down to about a minute left, Anna. I wonder if I can ask you, given that this country is set to welcome 500,000 new immigrants per year over the next, few years, how do you think all of the issues that we've been talking about today need to evolve in order to deal with that new reality?
Well, I think everyone should study diaspora studies, right, Kamari?
A little plug for your department there,
A little plug for our center. No, because I think diasporas and immigrants and refugee experience are becoming central Canadian experience. Every story you covered right now is history of Canada. And I think sooner the society will understand that actually studying diasporic individuals, our students at the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies are mostly first and second generation Canadian. They wanted to know what is their story, what is their identity, what is their place in Canada. That's why they take our classes. And I think that soon it should be encouraged, and I'm hoping that because we turned our face to new Canadians and older Canadians with their diasporic roots, we will have a better society, healthier society where people understand each other, celebrate differences, and and don't suspect each other with double alliances and all this kind of stuff that was hurting and poisoning lives of a lot of people. So I'm hopeful that more immigrants come. More seriously, we'll take the field of diaspora studies and diasporas itself, and then we'll build a better society.
Fabulous.
Optimistic now.
Very optimistic, and not a bad place to leave it. Mr. Director, can I get a 3-shot, please, so I can thank all of our guests? There's Joanna Chu in the middle, coming to us from the Toronto Star in Vancouver. Anna Sternsis on the left-hand side of the screen from the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at U of T. And Kamari Maxine Clark, Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, U of T, on the right-hand side of the screen. Thanks to you three for coming on to TVO tonight and explaining this all so well. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, March 27th, 2023. Tomorrow, what's driving a startling rise in absenteeism among Ontario students, especially those in high school? We'll examine that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.